part of our Lenten journey, we're asking the question of how do you begin again? And I think this is one of those questions that Christians have to ask themselves on a regular basis, and is a really good question to ask at Lent, because Lent's about making those course adjustments through the year. What do I need to add? What do I need to take away to be more of who God wants me to be? Right? That's sort of one of the big questions of Ash Wednesday. And part of figuring that out is to figure out, well, how do I begin again? Now, sometimes this matches up really nicely with Lent. Sometimes the world just makes you begin again sometimes, right? You don't have choice about it. And so I went back and forth on how to tackle this question, and I came up with a really long, boring, god-awful sermon. So I started talking to friends of mine going, I have a sermon, but maybe if I keep polishing, I'll get it to a B-. And it was very theory, concept, boring. And a friend of mine said, dude, the reason it's theory, concept, and boring is you've begun again many times. You should talk about you beginning again. And how did you do it? So that's what I'm going to do today. Now, this is just me and what I learned from times that I had to begin again. It may apply to you. It may not. But it's my journey. So here's the thing. The first time I had to begin again, I didn't even realize I was beginning again because I was too young to sort of think through all this. But reflecting back, I realized I went through a begin again, and I actually came up with steps. Again, didn't realize it in the moment. See, when I was in second grade, I came down with leukemia. ALL leukemia, for those of you who care. Back in the 80s, that's something that 50% of people died from. Nowadays, because of the wonders of technology and the gift of a God that science is, it's 96, 97% survivable. Thank God for science. But in the 80s, in Texas, there was a whole nother thing going on, something I would not figure out for a number of years. See, during second grade and third grade, I was like that poor cancer kid you see in all the commercials. Half my hair is falling out. I look sick. I look awful. And so it's very easy to sympathize and pity me when I was in second and third grade, which made it really easy for my teachers and my administrators to push back against a lot of parents. See, because there's something else going on in the 80s, for those of you who lived through it. It was the AIDS epidemic, right? And in the Deep South, thank you, evangelicals and non-denominationals, they made a false equivalency. The false equivalency was to try to link AIDS to homosexuality. Now, we know there is no correlation, right? Neither scientific or theological between those two things. But what it meant in Deep South Texas was houses were getting firebombed. What it meant for me in Deep South Texas is I looked sick, and that meant the administration and my teachers were getting calls going, I don't want one of those sorts of kids in my kid's classroom. Now, when I was sick and I didn't have hair, again, cancer, didn't have hair, there was a political will among administration and teachers to hold the tide of society back. So for second grade, third grade, but by fourth grade, my hair came back. I was doing pretty good. I was still going through chemotherapy. I'll do that till I'm in sixth grade. And started realizing I kept getting beaten up. I kept getting bullied. Won't be till sixth grade. I'll try for 2 years to befriend the people, be nice. Yeah, it's just got me hit harder. By sixth grade, I realized, I got to come up with a different answer to this problem, because I'm going to middle school and nobody cares about what happens to you in 1980 in a Texas middle school. And so I remembered what I did. I sat down and said, okay, what is my situation? My situation is these popular kids, the sports kids, the jocks. There is no way in God's green earth they're ever going to like me, because they've been taught through their evangelical, non-denominational churches hate. And I can't change that. I do not have that power. And so they're going to keep wanting to beat me up. And I came up with a solution, because I realized, so first thing I did was take an honest look at my thing. Okay? Then the second thing I did was take a look at what resources, what do I have, what can I do about this? So I thought to myself, well, okay, my church is super supportive. St. Margaret's Episcopal Church saved my life during that period of time. Okay? God bless them. They were there for me. My parents were there for me during that period of time. And I went, okay, so I got 2 sanctuaries. Get home as soon as I can or get to church as soon as I can, right? Okay. That still leaves out that whole have to go to school thing. Then it dawned on me, I'm not the only kid getting beaten up on a regular basis here. There's all sorts of other kids who are marginalized for all sorts of other reasons, right? I'll reach out and get to know all of them. I'll befriend them. And I'll learn to stop caring what people thought about me. Because you know what? The popularity thing, it was gone. It was never going to happen. And I had to come to that realization. But I also had to come to the realization I got to figure out a way to be safe. Then, my third step. I said, all right, now I know my resources. Now I know my situation. How do I move forward? And so I moved forward. I befriended all the kids that were cast out for whatever reason they were cast out. Okay, whether or not it was race or poverty or whatever, right? And we created a group and we kept each other safe. Because goodness knows no one else was going to in 1980s Texas. I look back years later. Obviously, it was not that intentional when I was coming up with these things during 6th and 7th grade. But what I look back at is I learned something really important. I learned a sort of step-by-step process, right? Sit down, be honest with yourself. What is your situation? It's hard to be honest, right? What is my situation? My situation is I am up a creek because I'm going to junior high, okay? Then take a moment and say, what resources do I have? What can I affect change on? What can I not affect change on, right? I knew I had my church, I had my family, and I probably had these other kids who were getting beaten up too. But I got to stop caring what all the popular kids think because they're always going to hate me. There's nothing I can do about that. So I just got to give it up and give it to God. Be like, you deal with them, not me. Because I can't. Kid. I found that process to be super helpful. It's worth noting I do have a fourth step, which is to look back and see how did that change you? How did that new beginning make you better? And I can point to lots of things. Man, I am really good at not caring what people think. That is a handy thing as a pastor. I'll tell you right now, one of the reasons I was good early on in my career going into congregations at high levels of conflict is because I don't care what people think. You can write me nasty letters all day. 2, I'm really good at moving in and out of different groups and seeing other people's perspectives and respecting other people's perspectives. Because when you talk about everyone who's cast out of society in 1980s Texas, that's a lot of folks. Okay? With lots of different perspectives, many of them that don't match up with each other, that are in conflict with each other sometimes. But I can move in and out of all those groups because I can understand and respect and see the Christ in those people and the God in those people and how they were making the world better. Again, a good talent as a pastor, right? I can hear and respect different opinions, different ways of being, different views on the world. I also learned how to talk and talk fast. Also not a bad skill. That wasn't my only time of having to start again. High school goes pretty smoothly. College is even better. Get near the end of college. Now, it's worth noting the day I walked into Texas Lutheran University knowing nothing about Lutherans at all because I was an Episcopalian, I went ahead and decided I knew what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I was going to be a campaign manager. And not just any campaign manager. I was watching The West Wing, and in the last 2 seasons of West Wing, okay, which you know is a documentary about how it all works, okay, there were these 2 characters that would hire themselves out to whatever party would pay them the most. And I thought, that's who I want to be. Okay? Needless to say, I make it all the way to D.C., and realize that is not at all who I want to be. And I have this sort of momentary crisis of faith where I'd always thought about being a pastor. I come back, I go to Pastor Lori Riggy Jones, who's the campus pastor, and I go, Pastor Lori, I know this is going to totally take you off guard, but I think I might be meant to be a pastor. And she's like, oh, thanks God you figured this out. You're going to make us all insane. And then she asked me a question. She said, so are you going to be Lutheran or Episcopalian? She knew I grew up Episcopalian, but she knew I was theologically Lutheran through and through. I turned to her and said one of the dumbest things I have ever said. Well, you really should leave with the person who brought you, shouldn't you? Anyone know that term? No, okay. First service has heard that. Leave with the person who brought you. It's a stupid idea, but I mean, it's good if it's prom. It's bad if it's the rest of life. But hey, I'm 20-something, and this is one of the dumber moments of my life. It's okay. So I decided I'm going to go Episcopalian. Grew up Episcopalian, should go Episcopalian, do that. I'm going to ignore that I disagree with them on a whole slew of issues because that won't come. And move forward. And what I didn't know is I went ahead and I knew one of my former pastors had become bishop in the Diocese of Albany, not far from here. Albany's like 4 hours away. Okay? And so I thought, it'll be great. I will go through them. This was a very bad decision. See, what happened was, I did not know this, but the Diocese of Albany is super conservative. Like crazy conservative. So I'm going through candidacy. I'm at a Catholic seminary. There's a story behind that, but I don't have time for it in my sermon. And I get this letter from the Diocese of Albany because they're taking on the question of homosexuality, and they have decided that they are going to write their own creed. By the way, I'm always wary of people who write their own creeds. And one of the things in the creed that they want all the seminaries to sign on to is one saying that when you become an Episcopal priest, you will enforce a rule that would ban anyone, and I'm going to use the language of the time, not the language of now, who are gay or lesbian from all sacraments. Furthermore, Diocese of Albany said anyone who is in their family who does not publicly reject them and their children will be banned from all sacraments. Whew. Just to put that in perspective, that means if your brother is gay and you do not go in front of your church and publicly, cast him out, your child can't get a baptism. Whoa, yeah. Now, I came back, I'm like, whoa, guys, I can't sign this. This is, not okay on all sorts of levels, right? And they're like, well, you sign it or you're out. And then because I'm 20-something and I was really funny, I tried to theologize with them. They're like, oh, that's nice, but sign it or you're out. So I got kicked out. I'm really happy I did. Would never want to go down that road. God's table, not ours, right? God's font, not ours. So what happened is I find myself doing the same analysis that I did earlier. I said, all right, what's my situation? Well, I just got kicked out of candidacy, which means in about a week they're going to call my seminary and I'm going to get kicked out of all my classes. And then about a day or two later, because I am employed through the seminary, I'm going to lose my job. Yay. Life is looking up. I'm going to be unemployed in a 200 square foot apartment I can't afford in about 3 months. All right, in San Antonio, Texas. So that's my situation. What resources do I have? Well, my parents were super supportive. My church was super supportive. Pastor Lori was super supportive. And I had this girl that I was dating at the time. Her name was Rachel. And I realized, the only reason we haven't gotten married and me moved to Connecticut is because I'm going to seminary. Well, that's over. And so eventually I propose. She said yes. We're still married 17 years later. Hopefully going to go for another 50 or something. And I moved to Connecticut. I learned a lot about myself in that little fight. One, I learned the church doesn't care about theology as much as it says it does. Two, I learned the dangers of when politics starts getting too far into a church either way, right? Three, I learned, man, I'm never stopping anyone from a sacrament for any reason. because I didn't realize how much I believed in that until I was put on the spot. But that's true in a lot of things, right? You don't know what you believe until you have to make a choice sometimes. And I figured out, though it took me years and a lot of chats with Pastor Lori, to figure out that my misstep was to stay with the Episcopal Church, not to go into candidacy. And ended up going back and becoming a Lutheran pastor you see today. But here's the thing. Those are two of the times I had to restart. There are dark, hard moments. But in those dark moments, I found it's really important to pray to God, because God will help you be honest with yourself, which is the hardest part of all three of those steps, right? Because one of the hardest things to do is to sit down and honestly look at yourself, look at your life, and give a truly honest opinion of this is my situation. Talk about the good and the bad of it, right? That's not an easy thing to do. It's easier when you're on your knees. 2, sitting down and saying, how the heck did I get into this situation? Good or bad? Is not an easy conversation, especially when it's bad, especially if you've played parts in it. Which most cases, we play some part in how we got into the situation we got ourselves into, right? Not always. Not my fault I got cancer. That just happens, right? And then lastly, once you know where you are, once you know what you can affect, then you can start marching. Things you can't affect, you hand to God. The things you can, you do something about. And you slowly march and persist forward into that mist in front of you, even when you don't fully know where you're headed. Because when you walk in faith through the shadows of death, you truly are following God. But as you go out today, no matter how big or how little, you are being called by God to start again. I ask you, how are you being called to begin